Welcome. This is the LaRouche Pack Saturday class series. We're starting a new course with Bruce Director. And the idea is to continually bring to life the sense of an intellectual devotion and political aggressiveness that Lyndon LaRouche brought to bear in his courses going back to the mid-1960s. That people are recruited to a political mission because there's a clear relationship between the quality of ideas and quality of thinking and the willingness to bring a total commitment to the truth to the most important political aspects and fights of our time. And that's the commitment we've got at LaRouche Pack. And that's certainly the nature of these class series, is to try to bring to bear a kind of a full spectrum discussion of all the most important aspects that people are confronting today, recognizing that as human beings, when we're confronting a political crisis, a cultural breakdown, but also a remarkable opportunity, remarkable buildup and ferment and activation of the American people, that it's what makes us human that gives us the ability to perpetually always survive. That there's an intrinsic opportunity of immortality in the nature of the human mind to respond to ideas and overcome any system's boundaries, any system's problems. We can overcome them. And so that really is, I think, the intrinsic nature of this discussion with Bruce over the next few weeks. And I think people will have a lot of fun with it and hopefully bring a lot of good discussions and questions, as you have many times before. Let me just situate the discussion tonight. Of course, we know we have our traitor-in-chief, Joe Biden, hanging out, kind of trailing in behind. If people have seen the videos of him slowly walking, tiptoeing to make sure he doesn't fall, behind the G7 leaders, really governed by what's an explicit role of the British Crown. And as people know, we've here focused on the role of the British Crown, whether it be in Russiagate, whether it be in COVIDgate, how this whole process is unfolded, that there's clear roles that the British Crown plays in this globalist system today. And so to see Biden paying obeisance to the Crown and this is really kind of somewhat non-entities. The nation, they're really just countries or territories of Europe. Many of them have lost the idea of a sovereign nation state. Certainly that's been true with Canada under Trudeau. And what Trump brought to bear in terms of sovereignty has to some degree been lost. Or they're attempting to erode it, to wear it down just in the last 5 or 6 months because of its very real, viable threat to this kind of globalist global reset. But we're also seeing the inability of these clowns to confront reality. There is an intrinsic inability to can even confront how to govern the United States. Biden and his radical Dems and the rhinos that support his efforts are not finding ability to pass legislation. They can't overhaul the legislative process. They can't overhaul the Supreme Court. They don't necessarily control the election process. You see fights in Arizona. I think something like 16 states will ultimately visit Arizona's Maricopa County for this audit process. The implications of that are yet to be seen, but could be very significant. And then you've got what Biden is attempting to do in foreign policy and this whole globalist great reset. And we may see what that ends up looking like, or we'll have a better sense of how other nations are responding. We saw China read the Biden team the Riot Act as they tried to pull some kind of imperial dictatorship. We may see the same thing with Putin and Biden. And I raise that not so much to discuss foreign policy tonight, but to remind people of what I would imagine is one of the most unprecedented incidents in American in heads of state diplomacy. It was a few years ago now, almost 3 years, that Putin and Trump met in Helsinki, Finland. And Trump responded to the Putin-Biden summit with a statement on his Telegram channel. And what he said reminded people, when he was asked, he said, as to who do I trust? Because at that time, at that press conference, he was asked, do you trust Putin and Russia? Because Putin said they didn't intervene in the election. Or do you trust your own intelligence community? And Trump famously at that press conference said, "I trust Putin." So the banshees at MSNBC and the Department of Justice went absolutely nuts, the Rosensteins of the world. So Trump put out a statement just at the end of this week. He says, and in that statement, he says, "As to who do I trust?" they asked, "Russia or our intelligence from the Obama era?" Meaning people like Comey, McCabe, the two lovers, Brennan, Clapper, and numerous other sleazebags, or Russia. The answer, after all that has been found out and written, should be obvious. Our government has rarely had such lowlifes as these working for it. Good luck to Biden in dealing with President Putin. Don't fall asleep during the meeting, and please give Putin my warmest regards. So that's sovereignty. It's irony. It's a sense of optimism that we can solve problems, not only the problems that confront us globally with various issues that are at stake, but really the way that this globalist program has infested our own institutions, and that we have deep rotten treason within the American institutions that we, the American people, have to address. And it's with that, which I think a sense of idea, a sense of humor, and a sense of optimism towards the future that we proceed in this course series. So Bruce, with that, I'll open it up to you, let you jump into things, and we'll look forward to people's questions and discussion.
What I intend to begin tonight, and we will continue this over as the next 4 weeks, is to try and solve a problem which we all run into in trying to organize others, but also a problem we all run into in ourselves in trying to figure out how to conduct ourselves in this crisis. Another way to put this is, how do we navigate the current situation, both as individuals and as a society? How do we organize our fellow citizens to be able to develop the ideas and the orientation so that they can begin to think about how to navigate themselves and this country out of the crisis. Now, and the way you organize others, of course, is always by externalizing your own experience. That is, it's always the case with teaching. Every good teacher knows this, that the best way to learn something is to teach it to someone else. Young children learn this at a very early age, because once they catch on to how to solve a problem or some new discovery that they've made in school or in their play or anything else, they immediately want to teach it to someone else. And by teaching it to someone else, to another child, to a parent, they immediately discover the things that they know and the things that they need to still know. And so what I intend to do in these next over the next 4 weeks is to have a discussion with you and among ourselves, where we will take up various questions to help us understand the question that I raised tonight at the beginning, which is, how do we navigate this current situation? Now, the issue of navigation, of course, is I chose that term very thoughtfully, because the question of navigation has always been associated with the development of civilizations. Mr. LaRouche wrote about this quite a bit, as well as other scholars and writers, going all the way back to the historians from ancient times that still survive today. But one of the key aspects of is a characteristic of a developing society is a increasing capability for navigation. in human society, this is, of course, associated with not just navigation on land, but more importantly, ocean navigation. Some of the earliest civilizations, of course, develop around the mouths of rivers, and so they're maritime civilizations, and their organization of their societies is associated with navigating rivers and navigating the oceans beyond the mouths of the rivers. Of course, one of LaRouche's favorite projects to advocate was an increase in underwater archaeological expeditions, because many of these ancient civilizations are now underwater. There's a famous case about 10 years ago or so where a Greek city was found in very well preserved conditions in the Black Sea, because the Black Sea was at one time a freshwater lake. And when the seas rose and the ocean waters flooded the area across the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus into the Black Sea, the salt water floated on top of the fresh water and blocked out the oxygen. And so the cities that were buried under the fresh water remained very well preserved. And this is probably true with other areas, other ancient civilizations, which would help inform our knowledge of the development of human civilization. That's a bit of an aside, but it just gives you the indication of the kind of interest that LaRouche had, and I have, and I think many of you have, about trying to learn more about history. But let's get back to this question of navigation. Navigation, in order to become a functioning society, a functioning economy, one has to develop, a society or culture has to develop means for navigation. Now, when you're navigating on the oceans, your means of navigation is really not, the simple way of using landmarks or something that you would in sort of local navigation in a land area. But you have to situate yourself in a different, in a world that's beyond what is directly associated with your sense perceptions. Because on the ocean, your sense perceptions really have a difficulty differentiating the landscape, obviously. So in order to successfully navigate over ocean waters, it's necessary to be able to situate yourself on Earth, your positions on Earth, with respect to the stars. And the stars are not always in the same place. In fact, no stars are in the same place, although in this period of history right now, the North Star, Polaris, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, is roughly in the same place, but even that moves around significantly if you want to get precise measurements. The stars are always moving. So this requires an understanding of the rising and setting of the stars, how they move, how their observed positions move with respect to a fixed position on Earth, and how those observed positions move relative to a moving position on Earth. So, and of course, there's the famous speech of Prometheus in the Aeschylus trilogy. For those of you who don't know the Prometheus story, there are actually several versions of it, but the one that Aeschylus recounts in his great drama is that Prometheus has offended Zeus by caring for mankind and giving man fire That's the general, the most well-known aspect of what Prometheus did. And for that, Zeus has punished Prometheus and chained him to a rock for all eternity. I'll spare you the rest of the story. You should read the Aeschylus trilogy, and maybe we'll at some point have a further discussion on Prometheus. But in his famous speech for why he has offended Zeus, Prometheus said, I've been chained to this rock because I cared for mankind. I gave mankind the knowledge of fire, but I also gave him the knowledge of the rising and setting of the stars, which are very hard to discern. I gave him number, and I gave him poetry, music, and art. Now, so Prometheus, it was expressing that. He said, and in that speech, I should just add that in that speech he says, before man had these capabilities, astronomy, number, art, music, fire, before that, man was living like an animal. Now, so what distinguishes human civilization is the ability to develop concepts in the mind, because, and none of these concepts, music, art, number, even the knowledge of fire and how to use fire, is anything that is evident from what your senses tell you. All these things arise in the mind as ideas. And the ideas, as Plato emphasized, as LaRouche emphasized, as Leibniz talked about, as every great philosopher talked about, are not visible. They can't be seen. They can't be touched. There's nothing about them that can be physically, that has any physical attributes. And they exist inside everybody's mind individually. No one can see the ideas of another person, and no other person can see your own ideas. But yet we can communicate with each other, and we can understand with very good precision, especially using the capabilities that we get from art, music, metaphor, and so forth, to be able to do something which is quite extraordinary, which is to relate ideas from one individual to another. And in that way, we go beyond simply navigating our own individual location and position, and begin to think about and act on and effectuate navigating society as a whole. And this is, of course, really the definition of leadership, because what happens in the organization of society is that you have leadership emerges, which shows people the way. We're seeing a very beautiful example of that in the podcast series that Bob Ingram and Mike are conducting on Lincoln, where you see a man of his qualities and capabilities and history rises to the occasion where he navigates not only his own life, but also leads the nation, shows the way. We have to do that today to our fellow citizens. And LaRouche has often stated that the way to do this, or the one thing we have going for us in this effort, is a phenomena which he identified with reference to an essay by the great English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley called In Defense of Poetry. And what Shelley said is that in a period of crisis like the one he was in, or the one we're in now, that there is a capability among people which emerges, and I believe the quote is, to receive and impart profound, impassioned conceptions concerning man and nature, profound and impassioned conceptions concerning man and nature. Now, and that is the capability that if you're conscious of, we can wield in this period. So with that introduction, I think I hope you understand a bit about what we're trying to do here in at least these discussions, that we have to learn how to navigate, that we have to learn how to situate ourselves in the real universe that we're actually in, which is not the universe that most people think it is. Now, as I indicated, navigation requires the development of ideas. It does not require information. People today have become really dumbed down, especially because we rely on things like Google and Google Maps and so forth to tell us where we're going. But of course, everybody has the experience that if you follow the route that Google Maps tells you to follow, they leave out all kinds of things because the computers that are sending up information, and if you think about it, there's a ton of information, a mind-boggling amount of information that is transmitted from cell phones to satellites to computer servers and calculations, and then resent out to the cell phones, calculating speeds and directions and so forth of billions of devices all at the same time. So there's a huge amount of information involved in that, but somehow it seems to not really be in the real world. It's get good approximation to be able to find the next gas station, but it can't help you in being able to afford the increase in the price of gas that's a result of Biden's inflationary and the Fed's inflationary policies. So that's not what we mean by navigation or being able to orient yourself and know where you are. It means you have to situate yourself in the real physical and historical developments of the world. LaRouche used to always, provoke people and also in many ways amuse them by stating he was more than 2,000 years old. And what he meant by that, as he would explain to us, is that 2,000 years old means that he is always living in history. He was always thinking about what are the historical developments that have led to this condition. What historical developments that are occurring today are developing into the future? He often called this, the current events, he called present history. So you're looking at the development of history, the development of mankind, and the development, all kinds of developments that have been occurring over the last 2,000 years. So one has to be able to think in that direction. Secondly, you're also looking at man is not living among simply other human beings. We are interacting, at least on the earth, for example, in a world which is dominated by the laws that seem to apply to non-living processes, the laws of physics. And then we have the existence of life, the phenomenon we call life. And life is a unique physical phenomenon. There's an absolute distinction between living organisms and processes associated with living processes versus those of the so-called lithosphere, the physical world. And they interact, as the great Russian geophysicist Vladimir Vernadsky researched in great detail. Life in the non-living parts of the earth, for example, are interacting everywhere over time. And over long periods of time, life, which appears to be a weaker force than non-life, if you think about the kind of power that's associated with the non-living parts of the earth, volcanoes, earthquakes, these kinds of things, tornadoes, hurricanes, big physical processes. Living processes are extremely weak. Yet over time, living processes actually come to dominate. Living organisms, tiny living organisms, turn rocks into soil and transform the earth, transforms the atmosphere, and so on. And then Vernadsky discussed that human life actually then intervenes and interacts both with living organisms as well as non-living. And so you have this interaction between these three domains and into a what Vernadsky called the noosphere. But then LaRouche talked about a fourth domain, the domain of the way man interacts with man to interact on the noosphere, the biosphere, and the lithosphere. We'll explore this in more detail probably next week. But I want to introduce this idea just to give you a sense that to navigate through this situation, you have to think about how you have to have a concept of the universe in which you're acting. We're acting in a world which is not just human beings interacting with other human beings, say, for example, in the domain of politics or social media or communication. You're having to act on what Riemann would call a manifold. And I want to introduce this idea of a manifold, which probably more in future classes, we'll go into it in more detail. But a manifold, another term for manifold would be, say, a phase space. But it's a concept of all the various interacting processes. In the case of the political process we're really trying to navigate through right now, you're talking about an interaction of human living life, non-life, historical processes, cognitive processes, and so forth, not just on the earth, but also in near space and very distant space, because we have the capability now as human beings to look very deeply into the, see very far into the universe, much farther than any society has ever been able to do. So you have to be able to develop a concept of how all these things are interacting simultaneously at your one location, and then chart a course from that location for yourself and society that will show the way Lincoln did in leading the country out of the crisis of the Civil War. Now, this is something which great leaders do somewhat intuitively, but also with a lot of intellectual effort. But it also requires a bit of training, and there's many ways to get that training. But and there are many routes. I'm not proposing a one in particular is advantage over the other, but all these routes, all these pathways to develop that capability in your mind all involve certain exercises. We used to call them pedagogical exercises. In education, they're called pedagogical exercises. In some religious contexts, they're called spiritual exercises. But what it involves is taking a particular set of paradoxes and working through the solution to those paradoxes as a way of training the mind to think in a certain way. And then you can take the way you've trained your mind, the experience you have of solving that problem, and that gives you a capability to then look at something which is not so simple but for which the same type of approach can be applied. Now, LaRouche emphasized that a very good way of developing that capability is to look at certain key problems in science that will inform you of the kind of thinking that's required to be able to understand exactly how to navigate a situation, how to be able to orient yourself as to where you are, and how to look for a way out. Now, I'm going to give you a couple examples tonight, just to sort of give you a taste of how this works. And we will refer you, if probably over the course of the next few days, to some key articles by LaRouche that are available that you can refer yourself to, and also to some articles that I've written that might help you. Now, but first, the first exercise I want to present to you is one that might be surprising because it's a contrast between the way you might naively think this question of navigation is dealt with versus a broader way of thinking about it. And that is something which is a very fascinating study, which I'll just give you a taste of, because it's really a whole, in some cases, a whole life's work in itself. And that is the story of the honeybee. Now, I'm particularly referring to the work of a German-Austrian physiologist and scientist named Karl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology for work he did. He won the prize in the late 40s, early 50s. I don't remember the exact date, but he won the prize for work he did in the 20s and 30s on the study of honeybees. Now, the honeybees have a very interesting characteristic, which is that they have a very organized hive society, so to speak, which has differentiated division of labor. And one of the key elements that's crucial to the survival of the hive is the ability of the foraging bees to go out and find good sources of nectar, and then be able to ingest that nectar and carry it in their bodies and bring it back to the hive and deposit the nectar in the hive and in the various cells of the hive in order to be able to both feed and breed for the further development of the hive. Now, I'm not suggesting that a beehive is any way a model for human society. Quite the contrary. Although Bernard Mandeville, one of Benjamin Franklin's enemies, and one of the proponents of the British Empire and a very vicious opponent of the American Revolution, wrote a paper called The Fable of the Bees, in which he tried to do exactly that. And he said, if you look at a beehive, every little bee does its own little grubby thing. And what he described is that private vices lead to public virtue. Every bee satisfies its own personal desires. And by satisfying its own personal desires, the good of the hive works, the whole hive develops. And that was his argument for free trade and complete libertarian society. But humans are not bees, and our society has nothing to do with beehives. But there is something very interesting that bees do that will inform us about this question of navigation. I'm not advocating this organization of society on bees, but their human discovery by Karl Frisch in particular of how bees forage and how they navigate is quite instructive for what the point we're trying to investigate tonight. Now, it was commonly believed that the bees were colorblind because they had such small brains and such primitive eyes that they couldn't that were not physically capable of distinguishing, carrying the type of apparatus that was capable of distinguishing color. And that the main way in which the bees found the nectar was through some type of rudimentary sense of smell, which was understood as a chemical reaction between particles in the air and whatever olfactory sensory apparatus that the bees might have. So Frisch began to do some experiments on these bees and determined, one, that they were not colorblind. He did this simply by having a little container of sugar water, a transparent container of sugar water near the beehive, and the bees would learn that that's where they could get some good nectar. And he would put under this thing a blue card, and next to the blue card there were other sugar bees, other vats, containers of sugar water with different shades of gray. And he was able to train the bees to realize that the vat with the blue card had the sugar water in it and the others didn't. So proved that the bees could see color. And that made perfect sense because that's one of the characteristics of flowers. They distinguish themselves from the rest of the plant by their vibrant colors. Now, but there's another question that came up is how do the bees, if you look at a beehive and you get these phenomena where the bees go out and forage, and if they find a place with particularly juicy flowers that have lots of nectar in it, these foraging bees are able to go back to the hive and somehow communicate to the other bees exactly how to get to this area of good foraging. And this sometimes can be as far as 2, 3, 4 kilometers from the hive, which is a very long distance for a little tiny bee to be able to navigate precisely. And he did lots of experiments on this to show that this is exactly what the bees were doing. And he was trying to figure out how did the bees do this? How did they organize themselves so that they could get so far away and be able to communicate that to a large number of other bees who would then go out and get the honey and the nectar and bring it back and out of which the bees can make honey. So Mike, if you could put up the first picture, I'll show you what Frisch discovered. He did this by creating a beehive, which had, there we go, a beehive which had 2 transparent panes of glass so he could see what the bees were doing inside the hive. And what he saw, if you look at the bottom of this screen, he saw that when the forager bees came back to the hive, they had 2 types of things they did. One was the bee which was coming back and trying to tell the other bees where the honey was, would walk in a circle. And the other bees would start to follow them in that circle. And the speed at which the bee walked in that circle at sometimes was faster and sometimes was slower. So after a lot of very careful study, he figured out that what the bees were communicating was that if they walked in a circle, that there was foraging places within a 50-meter or 5-meter radius of the beehive. And the speed at which the bee walked around gave us an indication of exactly where in that 5-meter radius the honey could be found or the nectar could be found. So the bee the bees could then fly out of the hive and fly around in a small radius looking for these flowers, and they could find them. But then when the bees went further than that, went a far distance, in some cases, 2-3 kilometers away from the hive, the forager bees would come back and they do a different type of dance. And that you see on the right side in the bottom. It was a dance, he called it a waggle dance, where the bee would go in a semicircle and then walk a straight line, and then go in a semicircle to the left, and then walk in a straight line, and then go to semicircle to the right and walk in the straight line, and so on and so forth. But when they walked in the straight line, they waggled their tail. They went in a waggly direction. And so the bee was creating a certain geometric shape, and he was trying to figure out what this was actually communicating. Well, if you look at the top slide, you can see what it is, that the bees were, through the waggle dance, were able to communicate to the other bees the location of the flowers by the angle between a direct line of flight to the flowers and the angle of the sun. So that they angled their waggled part of the dance, you can see that on the right, to the angle that a direct flight to the flower made with the direction to the sun. So on the left side, if the flowers are directly in line with the sun, then the straight line part of the dance went straight. And if the angle was to the flower was at an angle to the direct line to the sun, the the waggle dance was at an angle. That's pretty interesting. Now, the other thing he tried to figure out is, well, how could they navigate with respect to the angle of the sun? Because they were able to do this even on cloudy days where the position of the sun wasn't ever known. So he developed a more sophisticated experiment where he studied he had a hunch that had something to do with the polarization of the sunlight. Now, this is something we don't see, but the bees do see it. And that is that you can actually do an experiment if you have a pair of polarized sunglasses. You can put that down, Mike, and I'll try to illustrate this with my hands. But you can, if you have a pair of sunglasses, polarized sunglasses, and you take them out on a sunny, on any time, sunny day or not, and you rotate them like this, you'll see that there's a certain angle that the glasses get a little bit darker than another angle. And the angle of maximum lightness and the angle of maximum darkness are perpendicular to each other. And that angle changes with the sun. It changes with the angle of the sun. So the bees, he showed with his experiments that the bees actually can detect, their eyes are able to detect this change in angle of the polarization of the sunlight. And so they can follow this angle, or they communicate that angle in the waggle dance, and then they can follow that angle to get to the foraging place. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, and if you're interested, you can actually Google Carl Frisch Nobel Prize lecture. It was given by his son because he was sick at the time, but it's a very interesting lecture, and there's also plenty of other material. You can study that more. I was particularly fascinated by this, and I wanted to share it with you tonight because it tells you something about this question of what kind of universe are you situated in? It helps develop this idea of a manifold, because the bee obviously has a different manifold than the one we might perceive. We don't see the polarization of light, and we don't, before Carl Frisch, we didn't even pay attention to this so-called waggle dance, and it didn't mean anything to us anyway. But if you think about this problem, the way navigation works with respect to the bee, it's a different world than the one you're in, or at least appears to be a different world. Yet with Carl Frisch's discovery, now we can understand the bee world, and we can understand our world as well in a different way. So I'm trying to point out this to try and get you to help you develop in your mind this concept that when you're dealing with navigation, you have to be able to think about factors and elements which are acting on the world that you may not be able to perceive with your senses. Now, let me go very quickly to another example, because LaRouche said if you look at these examples, you can begin to get the sense of the kind of intellectual and mental experience you need to be able to figure out how we navigate ourselves out of this current crisis. I'm going to give you two. There's very, very many of them. I guess I've already given you one with the question of maritime navigation. But the second one I want to point out to you is from Kepler. Kepler, by the way, wrote a paper on honeybees and on the reason why the shape of their hives is always a nest of hexagonal chambers. But I'll leave the discussion of that. Actually, that's related to what I discussed the last class I did, but we can come back to that if you want. But Kepler was actually trying to determine what were the actual motions of the planets. Now, when you go out and you look at the night sky, as I mentioned, all the stars rotate, but there are some stars which move relative to all the other stars. That is, as the stars rotate, they don't change their position relative to each other. That's why, for example, the Big Dipper will rotate in the sky over the course of the night and from night to night, but the Big Dipper always stays the Big Dipper. And once you learn the constellation, the Big Dipper, you can go out in the sky and you say, oh yeah, there's the Big Dipper. The same thing with Orion and other constellations, which you know. Now, but there are other stars. These are called planets, and those planets, the word planet is the Greek word for wanderer, move from night to night in a different way than all the rest of the stars. And Kepler was trying to discover what the actual principles that govern these motions, because they're quite irregular. In sometimes the planets go backward, sometimes they go forward. They all have different periods and so on and so forth. So Kepler was doing, particularly honed in on trying to determine the orbit of Mars. That's partly because Mars was, one of the closest planets. It is the closest planet to Earth, and because Mars is easy to observe over long periods of time, and because his associate and teacher, Tycho Brahe, had spent many years painstakingly making many very precise measurements of the position of Mars with respect to the Earth. But if you try, Kepler was convinced that part of the motions that we observe of Mars were due to the motion of the Earth. Now, this was, of course, a revolutionary idea at his time, although the Greeks had already understood that the Earth was a moving planet and the sun was not moving, or moving very little. But Kepler was trying to figure out how to determine what the actual motion of Mars really was, not what it appeared to be, but what it really was. And in order to do that, since he realized that some of the motion that he was observing of Mars, was a result of the Earth's motion, he had to first figure out what the Earth's motion was. Now, this is, of course, a completely different problem, because how do you discover the Earth's motion when you're on the Earth? You're looking at Mars from the Earth, you can see Mars moving. But if you're on the Earth, how do you see Mars? How do you understand the Earth's motion? Well, he decided to do an intellectual trick. And he said, well, what would it look like if I were on Mars? What would the motion of the Earth be? Well, you ask, how could he know what the Earth would look like from Mars without going to Mars? Well, it was very easy, or not very easy. It was very easy once he figured it out. Why don't you put up the slide, Mike, that has Mars, Earth, and the sun in a straight line? Okay, so this is a very sketch, just a sketch. It's obviously not real, but it shows that at certain times of the year, or actually every, I think it's 687 days. Can't quite remember the number, but the Earth, Sun, and Mars are all in a straight line. That's called opposition. Now, the way you observe this from the Earth is that you see Mars rising in the east as the sun sets in the west, and you would see Mars setting in the west as the sun rises in the east, just at the same time. So you can imagine if you're standing on that green dot called Earth and you look to the west, you would see the sun, and you look to the east, you see Mars. Okay, they're all in the same line. And if you continue, you look at that line that's labeled zodiac circle. Those are the fixed stars that are in the sky behind Mars just as it's rising. Okay, and since you know the zodiac circle, you can imagine that if those are the stars that you see when Mars is rising, if you were standing on Mars, you would see the opposite stars. You would see the opposite stars behind the Earth. In other words, if you were on Mars and you looked at the Earth, you would see, well, in this case, you'd see the sun and it would be bright, but you can imagine what stars, even though you couldn't see them, would be observable to a Martian looking at the Earth. Now, that fixes Mars's position relative to the Earth and the sun at that point. Now, 687 days later, Mars comes back to that same position in the stars, but Earth, because it's moving around the sun at a different speed, will be in a different place. So why don't you show the next picture, Mike? Okay, so you wait until Mars comes back to that position in the sky, and you see that Earth is in a different position. And then you wait another 687 days, and now Kepler didn't have to wait because Tycho Brahe had given him these observations for many years. So he could just go back and look at the tables and see where the Earth and Mars were relative to each other. And he took 3 positions of the Earth and Mars, and applying the geometrical principle that 3 points determine a circle. And because the Earth's orbit is very close to circular, even though it's not precise, Kepler was able to determine a very precise orbit of the Earth by imagining and measuring what it would be like to look at the Earth's position if he were a Martian. Okay, that's a very short, you can put the slide down now, but that was a very short and cursory presentation of what Kepler actually did. But, and I urge everybody to really work through Kepler's study of this. In fact, Albert Einstein, on the 370th, I think, anniversary of Kepler's death in 1933 or 32, wrote an essay in a German newspaper on Kepler, celebrating this great achievement and saying that it is an example. He said, in times of uncertainty like we're in right now, it's very helpful to look at Kepler and see that his certainty and his belief in science and the power of the mind to discover things is the way to deal with these crises. I'm sort of butchering the quote, but just to show you the importance of Kepler's discovery and all of this particular discovery, but also the importance of his belief in the ability of the mind to discover things that are beyond the domain of sense perception. And that Einstein himself thought that this was a very important demonstration of what is needed to understand how to steer society out of the crisis it was in 1932-33. But what you see by the method is that Kepler had to, in his mind, take himself out of what appeared to be his position and to think about how he would, how navigating through this situation from a completely different place that he could never be and never see directly. There are other examples I could give, but I'd like to open it up for discussion. I'll just mention one of them, which is the work of Carl Friedrich Gauss, who in the 19th century, especially in the period around 1830 or so, was involved in a project with Alexander von Humboldt and Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Alexander Dallas Bache, to measure the magnetic field of the Earth. And they sort of used this as a scientific, it was the first worldwide scientific experiment. And they sort of use this also as a way to maintain communications between scientists and also Republican political leaders in Europe, the United States, and Russia, and other places in the world like Norway and Sweden and other places, where they set up magnetic observatories to measure the strength, declination, and inclination of the Earth's magnetic field at various points. They even set up, recruited ship's captains and designed apparatus that could be put on boats to measure this as they moved across the oceans. Now, you obviously can't see the Earth's magnetic field, but let me give you another example very quickly, going back to the bees. For a long time, people wondered, well, how do birds navigate? You have some species of birds which travels as much as 12,000 miles in their navigations. Some go across the big bodies of water, like the birds that fly from North America to South America across the Gulf of Mexico. And it's long been questioned and not understood, how do these birds navigate in this kind of environment? And it's been speculated, well, they use the angle of the sun or the angle to stars or so forth. But that really doesn't explain it, because if it's cloudy, you can't see the stars. During the daylight, they can't see the stars. They can't see the sun at night. And now there's a lot of evidence that the birds and other animals like migrating fish, like salmon, actually have an ability to sense the declination and angle of the Earth's magnetic field. And they actually navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, which is something which is completely outside the perceptual capability of human beings. The physical perceptual capability, but not beyond our mental capabilities. So again, these are just various examples that I hope will provoke you to think about what it means to navigate. You can't depend on how things appear to be. You can't depend on lots of information. Google gives you plenty of information. Most people have access to so much information right now, it's unbelievable. And yet they can't discern from all this information. They become, as you know, from talking and trying to organize people, they become very disoriented. They can't figure out how to navigate themselves through this situation. And so we have to apply these kinds of scientific methods. If we apply these kinds of scientific methods and we think about what it really means to navigate, we can develop the capabilities to actually figure out how we find our way in this current crisis and out of this current crisis. So I'll open it up for this discussion now, and hopefully you're at least intrigued enough so that you'll come to have a discussion now and come back over the next 3 weeks to see more about what I mean by finding your way.